Welcome back to Paranormal Perspective. I'm John Lorden, and joining me as always,
Christy Arnhart.
this is the show where Christy does the research looking into a paranormal or paranormal adjacent topic. She
Mhm.
presents her case to me, trying to pull me back from the brinks of skepticism. I try to apply just some logic, maybe a little bit of a critical eye, and see if there's something to her story, or if we should open it up to the realms of the paranormal and make me a believer.
Mhm.
Christy, very curious about this one because I have to set up the pictures. I've only seen the pictures, and it looks like we're talking about a real tragedy in this case,
Mhm.
right? What's
Yeah, we're
what
talking about two, actually.
okay. Want to tell us
Mhm.
what the topic is today?
Yes. Today, we're going to be discussing two different instances where horrific events occurred that left us almost a spiritual stain on the areas that it happened in.
Ooh, interesting. Okay. And do
Mhm.
we know what question we're going to put to the live audience that's watching this?
Yes. Can a traumatic death leave a spiritual impression on the environment?
Okay. It's a little too long for the poll I can write, but
Well, I figured too, but I don't know how to put it any smaller.
can trauma leave a spiritual impression? I think that'll do it. Okay. All right, please start.
Okay. So terrible things happen all the time, but some are so quick and so traumatic that even the people who are killed in these events don't know that they're dead yet. The first case that we're going to be looking at today is the crash of Flight 191 in 1979. And by the way, Mr. Fred Crook sent me this one. So
Okay.
thank you so much, Fred.
Okay. Let's take a look
This was
here.
one I remembered this from when I was a kid, but I hadn't thought about it until Fred brought it up. So, when everybody boarded Flight 191 at O'Hare Airport on May 25th, 1979, they had no idea that their plane's integrity had been compromised. There was damage to the left wing engine pylon that occurred during an earlier engine change. When the March 19th, the 30th, excuse me,
That's right.
there's a big ginger in front of my screen and I can't see what's
Uh-oh.
going on.
Oh, that's a
Could
problem.
you put your
Gi-
back down?
Ginger alert.
Here we go. Okay, they had done an engine change between March 29th and 30th of 79, and they were working with one of the three engines on the plane and the pylon that is attached to. And now the pylon is what attaches the engine to the plane itself.
Okay.
The aircraft had undergone some routine service during which the engine and pylon had been removed from the wing for inspection and maintenance. Now, officially, the removal of the engine should have called for the engine to be detached from the pylon before detaching the pylon itself. It was several different steps that they took to get this thing off of there. Several airlines decided that they had a better way to do it, so they developed a different procedure that saved about 200 working hours per aircraft. And
Uh-oh.
they said, more importantly, from a safety standpoint, it would reduce the number of disconnects, which are all the hydraulic lines, the electronics, and everything with the engine, from 79 to 27.
Okay.
So it took all of this down. And it's crazy when you hear it, though. What they did was they used an overhead crane and a forklift.
Okay.
And they ratcheted the thing onto it, they unhooked it, they took it down, and then they put it back on. But what that did was it left cracks in the wing.
Yeah, I mean
Nobody
basically
noticed it.
they were supporting the weight of it with parts that were not designed to be supporting the weight of it, is what it sounds like.
Well, no, it was the right weight and whatnot, but the way that the forklift and the crane worked together to take the engine off, it wasn't completely stable, and that
Okay.
caused cracks in the wing.
Okay.
And I mean, it's nearly impossible to do that right. I don't know what they were thinking. So unfortunately, these cracks in the wing set the stage for the disaster. The plane, here you see it after it's just taken off. It
Yeah.
cruised down the runway like it always had, but it was losing fuel and hydraulic fluid as it went, and they could even see that from the tower. As they left the ground, the damaged part of the wing that held the engine broke off, went above the wing, and fell down onto the tarmac below. Now, they made it about 350 feet into the air when air traffic control heard the pilot say, "Damn," and then that was it. You can see him, he tried to bank to the left.
Yeah.
That completely destabilized, and they went down. They ended up going down in a field nearby. It was just a huge explosion. And it's a miracle, really, that it didn't hurt more people than it did. Now, by the field, you can see the explosion
Yeah.
from the airport. It was so close. Beside the field that this plane went down in, sat a trailer park. Not only did 258 passengers die, 13 crew members died. 2 people at the trailer park died too. They lost cars. It was terrible. Now, within hours of this crash, people at the trailer park started freaking out and calling the police. They said that their dogs would stand at the fence even for months after the crash and bark constantly, having fits day and night. The residents of the trailers said that they started having people knocking on their doors and windows, and when they would go to investigate it, there wouldn't be anybody there.
Hmm.
As time progressed, it got worse, and it got to where they could hear people walking up the gravel of their drive. They could hear them stepping up onto their porch, rattling doorknobs and rattling windows. It was very scary. And then they started to see figures that would disappear. And it wasn't just the trailer park residents, it was people in the area of the crash too. One man was out walking his dog, and he said a young man walked up to him. He asked him, "I need to make an emergency phone call. Is there a phone that I can use?" There's no cell phones back then. The man had to stand there for a moment because the gentleman that he was looking at reeked of kerosene fuel and was smoldering. And he told him, he turned around and he said, "Well, there's a payphone right over here you can use." And when he turned back, the man was gone. There were other instances where they would see this young man on the phone in the booth and he would walk out and disappear as well. That to me is just scary. People in the trailer park actually started moving out of the area because it freaked them out so badly. The new people who moved in just reported the same problems over and over. Even after, and they were able to remove all of the wreckage, all of the bodies. Sadly enough, those flags are victims. They were able to get everyone out and they bulldozed over the land, but it didn't do anything to stop the paranormal activity in the area. And people still talk about it today. Any questions?
What's the most, well, I mean, it's strange because we're hearing a lot of stories about the experiences that have happened, but we're not hearing
Mhm.
like a particular, like, is there someone in terms of the recent occurrences? Is there someone that's like a TikToker that's doing coverage on this stuff? Or has
No.
anyone tried to capture any of these like
You
anomalies?
get some people who try to ghost hunt out there and do things like that, but I really couldn't find much on it.
Okay. Okay. Is this one that has Zach Baggins got to it?
No, as far as I know, he's never got to this one, and it
Yeah.
would be perfect.
It's
It's in a
probably a
field.
little, yeah, it's probably a little strange with it being a field. I know he kind of gravitates towards buildings a little more, but
Yeah, he
um,
does.
to your point about like a spiritual impression being left, I mean, a tragedy of this magnitude, of this size is going to certainly be that. The other thing is, I'm wondering about the possibility of the people that were there at the time being traumatized emotionally by what had happened,
Mm.
by knowing about
Oh,
this
yeah.
tragedy that happened right there, by having their neighbors, a few of the people living in the actual trailer park that passed away in this tragedy as well. Um, the emotional scarring and damage that they've gone through might leave them in a state where they're seeing things like this occur. What's curious to me is this aftermath of, like, people that are coming after the fact, and you kind of still have these haunting type episodes occurring. It's really just a
Hmm.
shame to me that we don't have like an example that we could, kind of point at of someone that's like, I have been living here for the past 15 years. Like I was born at this
Hmm.
point. It was after I'm after all this. And yes, the smoldering man, we call him, we see him, like just some affirmation about these things continuing to
Hmm.
today. And then of course, I want someone's ring camera that shows them answering the door or something, speaking to
Well,
an
of
object.
course.
Well, and speaking to, like, I would take one if they're speaking to even an object that isn't there, you know? But so, okay. All right. I don't know that I can discount that type of imprint happening at a traumatic place like this. It's hard because we don't have individual examples to go into, so I can't really try to dissect these occurrences, right? Because basically all we've got is like there's people that are saying this. So
Hmm.
it's hard to be really critical. And outside of that, I don't have the desire to be super critical about a tragedy of this nature and this many people losing their lives in this way.
Oh,
And
it was just horrible. I mean, everybody went down.
yeah, and if there's
And
some
it
way
was,
to remember them in terms of those stories kind of reminding the world about this tragedy, then,
hmm.
I'm not going to knock that either. So, yeah.
Yeah, they should have took the guy and showed him pictures of people from the flight, see if he could identify anybody.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But, they weren't thinking about the paranormal side of this, of course.
Yeah, did you run into any like official records, like in terms of did they report it to police about like, hey, there's some guy that's creeping around our trailer park or
No official reports, just it was said that they did report them. And there were firefighters and police officers living at the trailer park who had the same experiences.
okay. Yeah, that's good. That's worth knowing.
Mhm.
Okay.
Now, the second one I'm going to talk about, there's no recording evidence or anything of it either,
Okay.
even though a movie was made about it.
Okay.
Now, this one is Flight 401 that flew from New York to Miami in 1972. Now, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 had 163 passengers and 13 crew members on board. Flight was uneventful as it came out of New York, but when they started to get close to Miami, they started to realize they had a faulty indicator in the cockpit. And this faulty indicator made them believe the autopilot was on when it wasn't.
Oh, jeez.
So they had just been steadily losing speed and altitude this whole time. And they ended up crashing in the Everglades because they weren't able to come out of it.
Hmm.
75 people died, including the pilot, Captain Robert Bob Loft, and flight engineer Donald Don Repo. They were killed along with the 101. Oh, it's so sad. Well, days later, the wreckage from the aircraft was retrieved from the swamp, and believe it or not, they were able to save parts. They were able to save the galley. So, there were a lot of bits of it that survived. Now, that's when all the sightings started. When they took those parts and put them into another plane, an Eastern Airlines flight or an Eastern Airlines plane that flew. The first sighting that I heard about was on one of these flights. One of the flight attendants noticed that there was a captain sitting in first class. For whatever reason, she asked the man, can you check on the customers in first class? I guess to take a little, get a little help from him and take some off of their shoulders. But she said the whole time she talked to him, the man just sat there and stared and seemed distant, like he was almost shell shocked. The pilot came out and looked at him and realized, oh my gosh, that's Captain Bob. He disappeared. Now, the flight engineer, Don Repo, is also said to have shown up on these flights. And I hear more about him than I do the captain. One flight attendant opened one of the overhead compartments, and that's scary.
It's just
That's
this it's
just
heartbreaking,
it
like it's
is, because
yeah. Yeah, that
that was
was
loved.
yeah. Hmm. So,
So
okay.
she said that she opens up the overhead compartment to put some luggage in, and Captain Bob's face is staring at her out of it. That would have scared the crap out of me. And it did hurt. Now, on another flight, a flight attendant said she saw Dawn's face on the oven door in the galley. And she called two other flight attendants over and was like, look at this. I can see this face. And they saw it too. And before it disappeared, it said, watch out for a fire on this plane. While on the return flight to New York, an engine failed and had to be shut down before it caught fire. And on returning to the galley, another flight attendant saw one of the engineers fixing the oven. And she asked the flight engineer later, she said, what was wrong with the oven? And he said, nothing, no one's worked on the oven. So that must have been Dawn again.
Hmm.
There are so many other sightings. I couldn't even put them all in here. They would come on board and a captain would meet them coming off and he'd say, I've already done the pre-flight check. We're good to go. That was Bob. It wasn't the captain who was flying. And it seems like every time they showed up, wherever these parts were attached to whatever plane, every time they showed up, they prevented some kind of disaster from happening. Or at least put, the thought into their mind that, oh, keep an eye on this in case it happens.
It's an interesting story because
Mm-hmm.
um, I'm doing some searches right now because one of the things I'm having trouble believing in is like they pulled parts from a crashed plane and they reused them in other planes. Um,
Oh, yes.
the search result that I'm finding on it is, yeah, there's several people that are saying, at least they're confirming that there's rumors that that's what was done. But there are other people that are saying, no, this is kind of a regular practice and stuff like that can actually be reused. What I'm curious about is just, I know about like there's stringent quality inspections that have to happen for parts that go into planes. And I can't imagine. I mean, I guess if they re-verified the item, like
And it
then they could
and it's
get it.
72.
Yeah, yeah. But one of the other things, and this is, Google is now pushing its AI results at the top.
Yeah.
But it's saying that they believe the cause of this was pilot error. At least the official report concludes that pilot error was the cause. So it's kind of interesting to me that in
Oh.
the lore of this story, the pilots are effectively showing up, in other planes and trying
Mm-hmm.
to avert those disasters. So
Well,
yeah,
they said a year after this, they had so many complaints that they had the parts removed. And once that happened, they didn't have any more sightings.
yeah, yeah,
And you see the same thing, you hear about the same thing happening with the last tsunami that happened in Japan. It hit so fast and so hard, they had the same instance. People were hailing cabs. When the cabbie got to the destination, there was no one there. Phone calls, things like that. That one I could probably find footage and whatnot from, but
yeah,
it's just, they just don't know they're gone half the time. And God, that's so sad.
yeah. I'm just trying to trying to close this hoop in my brain on the reuse of parts. So at Quora, after the crash of Flight 401, there were reports that some salvageable parts from the wreckage were used in the repair of other aircraft. This practice was controversial and raised concerns about the safety implications of using parts salvaged from a crashed aircraft.
Mhm.
Using parts salvaged from a crashed aircraft can be a complex issue, while it is not uncommon for parts from retired or decommissioned aircraft to be reused, which makes sense. Like a retired aircraft, there was no fault that happened,
Yeah.
they just took it out. Um, Even in those cases, they undergo rigorous inspection and testing to ensure their airworthiness. In the case of Flight 401, the use of parts salvaged from the wreckage and other aircraft repairs may have raised questions about whether these parts were properly inspected and certified for airworthiness. Such practices could potentially compromise the safety. It's essential for airlines, so I don't think they really have an answer to it. They're basically just saying that they are supposed to be inspected, recertified
Mhm.
before being used. They are also saying that the aviation industry has stringent safety protocols.
Mhm.
Um, yeah,
Well, and Flight 401, if I'm not mistaken, was one of those that they were able to implement new protocols because of the accident and what went wrong.
yeah. Well, here's someone that says he's a former retired airline captain, according to his post on Quora. He's saying, "I was there that night. Rescue." Large portions of the airplane were intact. I know that a lot of equipment, the galley, radio, bar carts, were salvageable. Many of the fatalities were passengers who drowned in their seats in shallow water. I,
God.
I, I don't believe that critical airplane parts were reused. No, it isn't safe. I don't know where all the ghost stories came from, but some very weird occurrences were reported by crew members who knew the flight engineer who was killed, but kept reappearing on other L-1011s. So, wow. Wow.
And I really do. I think sometimes this can happen so fast and be so traumatic. It's like you get kicked right out of your body and you don't know what's going on.
Well, we're going to put it to the audience. I'm not going to run the poll very long because I have a feeling like I know where this is going to go because I myself, there's just, these aren't stories that you can kind of discount. I don't want to discount them, but
They're comforting in a way.
yeah, there is something comforting about it in a way. And it
And I'm
really
sure
it's
some,
pushing into like belief structures that are way above, like we're not talking about I mean, we are kind of talking about like there's a ghost or something like that, but this is not like a chase for Bigfoot type topic. Like these are pushing
mm-mm,
into belief structures that are like, what do you believe in terms of the afterlife and spirituality and what can
mm-mm.
happen? And so let's see what the audience says here. I'm just going to leave it open for maybe another 5 more seconds. Let's get your votes in there, guys, so we can get a pretty good sampling.
Well,
Um,
and really, it's not a residual haunting because if it was residual, it'd be like a movie. The same thing would play. People would see the same thing over and over. And that's not what happens in these instances.
yeah, yeah.
They're unique.
Well, as I thought for this one, can trauma leave a spiritual impression? We're going to go ahead and end the poll there. 94% of people say yes.
Oh,
Yes.
wow.
Yeah.
Okay, guys.
Yeah.
I mean, just think about all of the Civil War. You cannot go anywhere in Arkansas without tripping over a Civil War site.
Hmm.
Even my land is on the Trail of Tears. And you hear all the time about you see people fighting, you see people walking and things. I really do. I feel like when it's this traumatic, when they die, it definitely leaves its impression.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I'm more than happy to concede to this one because basically I'm not in the pit of skepticism when it comes to spirituality and believing that there's something after all this. So, if there is a time for me to give it up, it's definitely in this episode. So here it is. That was my skepticism hanging in an attic.
You got to have that in there.
That guy's still the most ridiculous story that we've covered on this. Actually, I'm not sure if it's him or the kid that's jumping on the bed that's supposedly levitating, but it's one of
the
those two. It's one of those two that are just by far.
See, San Pedro. San Pedro. I haven't been able to get a hold of anybody who was involved in the San Pedro incident yet,
Hmm.
but believe me, when I do, there's a major interview coming.
I won't hold
Major.
I won't hold my breath. But thank you so much for the hard research that you did on today's episode. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate you guys hanging out with us. Please join us again next week on another paranormal perspective. We will see you on the other side.